Hey everybody out there, my name is Dragnix, and this is Final Fantasy VII Reimagined. This is a free game. You can find the download link in the description below, but this is going to be a little bit different because I'm not going to necessarily critically cover this game. I really want to more talk about RPGs, the Final Fantasy series, Square Enix, and where I think the RPG has sort of fallen off the rails in terms of these old classic ones. Now, I will talk a little bit about this game in terms of it is a brawler, it is a beat-em-up style game. I'm going to play as Tifa here because, of course I'm playing as Tifa because she's the better character. I'm sorry, Cloud is a very, very boring character when it comes down. She at least has a story, is interesting, backstory, the childhood friend, but, she definitely make up for it in some of her personality traits and just being, this sort of fighter, this being part of Avalanche. So this is a basic brawler. This game is definitely a free game. This is a passion project by a bunch of people who really enjoyed the Final Fantasy series in terms of some of the classic games, and it shows. Now it does borrow the music heavily, and I wonder if Square Enix is going to say, okay, enough is enough. We're not going to let you have this. But these art assets are seemingly uniquely drawn. This is definitely something of a passion project for this person, so it is cool to see people so passionate about something that really take advantage of a universe and what they could do with it. Now, I will say that when it comes to the term RPG in today's world, I always have that little bit of a cringe because it feels like the RPG has evolved into something that I'm not necessarily a fan of. Now, I'm not going to say that there aren't modern day RPGs that I don't enjoy. I enjoyed Citizens of Earth, but although I will say it's mostly because it brought itself back to the old style of things. And I'm not talking about games like, The Witcher 3 or Fallout. I think that's a whole different genre that I'm talking about there. But I'm talking about games that, like Final Fantasy 13. And I want to put some backstory to this before I really explain where I think games like Final Fantasy 13 have gone so wrong, at least in my opinion. Now, again, everybody has their own strengths in games, and they can enjoy them how they want. And there are people who love Final Fantasy 13. Colleagues at Tetraptor that love Final Fantasy 13. I hated the experience. I never finished it. I never even got to the good part, as they would say, but I'll get to that. So, when I was growing up, I grew up with an NES, a Super NES. I was a Nintendo kid. And in particular, there was one game that I loved more than anything else. And it's not, the Final Fantasy VII. It is not Final Fantasy VI. It's Chrono Trigger. Now, I loved Final Fantasy VI, don't get me wrong, but when I had a chance, I would always keep on replaying Chrono Trigger. The reason for that is that I felt like the game was such a strong on almost every level. Like, the fighting was tactical, and yet it had something different about it in terms of the precision, in terms of the X attacks, where you could have, like, the X slice between characters. Combat was simpler in terms of magic, but also felt a lot different in terms of some of the abilities and uniqueness of each fight. Now, I say that understanding that, we've evolved a little bit. Now, I remember those RPGs fondly. Final Fantasy VIII, Final Fantasy IX, Final Fantasy VII, yeah, I don't say it's the best, or even in the top 3 of the Final Fantasy series, but I will say I enjoyed it. It's right around 12 where I think things start to fall apart for me. And in particular, it's one change that really started to, start the, I guess, the downfall, I would say, is the best way of putting it. Which, we've seen the Final Fantasy series hasn't met as much to the industry over these last years. Got my ass kicked. Oh, time to do that again. But It's the fact that I think it took player control away. Now, everybody knows about Final Fantasy XIII, and you can only really play as one character at a time. Now, you can set up the other characters in different ways to attack and, you know, be sort of healers and things like that, but I think that's where things started to go afoul for me, because I love the control of Final Fantasy in terms of the tactics and being able to really react with every character to each situation. Now, like, we have Final Fantasy VII's active time system. That still worked, because even if I didn't necessarily take advantage of it right away, I could always go and, like, take a moment and say, is this the right way of doing things? You know, in terms of, like, how I'm attacking a character or how I'm dealing with a situation. Now, using Cure on a zombie, for example, being creative with your characters, comboing, using Reflect to, you know, take out a person who has Reflect on themselves. You know, things like that really drove home how well those games could really get down on a tactical level. But then you started taking Final Fantasy XII into account with, like, sort of its gambit system, and, like, you only control one character at a time, and the other characters you can control by setting up rules. But, you know, I don't want that. And I think that's where part of the issue comes in the fact that, you know, I want to be able to really control every character. And I feel like that was done for the sake of, you know, people being bored. Like, okay, I have to wait for another character to really take advantage of things. I think it was a different strength. And while the modern day interpretation works for some people, it definitely doesn't work for me. But not only that, I think part of the bigger problem in terms of Final Fantasy is the storyline. Now, Final Fantasy, all the storylines are different. I mean, you do have some central themes that can pop up in all of them, but what I mean by that is the interest in the characters. Now, Final Fantasy VII, it's a part of the reason why I say Final Fantasy VII isn't necessarily the greatest in the series. It has interesting characters in Tifa, Yuffie, Vincent, but like some of its main protagonists, like Cloud, for example, I don't find him interesting. I find him rather boring. I don't find Ares interesting in some ways, but boring in others. Now, when I take a look at things like Final Fantasy IX, and I look at Zidane, I look at Quinna, I look at Vivi, I look at even Steiner, who's the typical soldier prototype, but he's got some interesting elements to him. And those characters really feel unique compared to everything else in the series. And even like Final Fantasy VI. Oh, here we go. Sometimes this game bugs out, so I can't jump, so I have to use different abilities here to try to get out of it. I'm not sure what the story about that is. I don't expect too much out of the game, but, you know, I do expect the controls not to screw up on me like it does at times. But, so yeah, Final Fantasy VI, you know, you can go down the line in terms of Final Fantasy VI with interesting characters. You know, you got Sephiroth, you got, I hope I got that, Setzer. Sorry about that. The Gambler. You got, you know, Ceres, who's, you know, this, you know, general, but, you know, she's got an interesting side to her in things like, you know, the opera series, the opera scene. It is really, really awesome, and it has a bunch of characters and stories that I really want to know more about. I really want to know what makes these characters, what brings these characters to life, what drives them. And I feel like at times the RPG, in particular modern day version of the RPG, has taken that for granted in terms of making the characters more generic. You know, when I look at Final Fantasy XIII's character roster, I'm really trying to remember what their character roster was. Like, define who Lightning was. I couldn't. It defined one character trait that really made Lightning Lightning. I mean, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, where Lightning was such a boring, you know, protagonist that I'm just sitting there going, why am I playing as her? Like, why should I even root for her at this point? Because I really feel like there is absolutely no reason to root for her. She's not that interesting of a character, first of all, and second of all, I just don't believe in her. I don't believe in what she's doing or her cause or, you know, any backstory when it comes to who she is. that wasn't the same with the old Final Fantasy games. Even with Final Fantasy VII, where I say Cloud is a boring character, I do root for Tifa. I do root for, you know, the childhood friend that may have some tropes to her, but she feels unique. And I wonder, you know, it's why I'm so trepidatious. You know, I'm so cautious on Final Fantasy 15. Like, it's like, okay, everybody's getting excited for it. It's going to be like the old Final Fantasy games, and I'm sitting there going, has Square Enix proven anything about the Final Fantasy series that I'm unaware of? Now, look, at least Square Enix has bravely default to sort of say, hey, look, we remember the old games. We know how good they could be. We know. We listen to you guys. But I guess I can't trust it. And especially the fact that, you know, I feel like we've almost lost our way in terms of the RPG and some of the elements that have made it. Now, I will admit, you know, games can evolve. Games can evolve to be different in terms of everything that they are made up to be. And sometimes that evolution can be fantastic. The World Ends With You is a Square Enix RPG that I can say, yeah, I immensely enjoyed how they evolved that game. But you have to remember, there are still core elements of that game that followed the old RPG formula. Interesting characters. While Neku wasn't necessarily the greatest of characters, in essence, there was something interesting about him. Even Shiki, who wasn't necessarily, you know, that unique in herself, she had unique elements about her in terms of, like, you know, her appearance being completely different than who she was. The idea of her being like a seamstress. And then you had somebody like Beat, who's, you know, felt like so different from everything else out there. Joshua. I hope that Square Enix realizes that maybe not necessarily the strength of their games in terms of some elements of their games may not be at the core some of the gameplay elements, but maybe some of the way that they tell their stories and how they go about user control. But most of all, I want to talk about the idea that where I see like a Final Fantasy remake situation being so troubling is the fact that I don't know if they're going to get it right. I don't know if you touch something like that and it just all goes to shit. Because I've heard that, okay, they're going to take out the active battle system. Why? It worked so well. It was so enjoyable. Why take that unique combat situation and that situation where, I guess if a modern day audience doesn't like it, okay, I think it does, and you're not giving it enough credit. But more so the fact that, you know, this isn't supposed to be a nostalgic game. This is supposed to be a nostalgic experience. Why change that? Alright, I've ranted for long enough. I hope you guys got an understanding of a little bit of what I'm talking about. This is Final Fantasy VII Remastered. I hope you enjoyed a little bit of the gameplay. Again, the link is in the description below. And I will see you all later this week with more critical reviews. Hey everybody, thanks for watching. If you like this content and want to see more of it, you may want to hit that subscribe button on the left-hand side. If you like this video and want to see more of this content, take a look at this video on the left-hand side as well. And if you've missed my last video, take a look at the right-hand side. Once again, thanks for watching, and keep on gaming.